In the spring of 1981, we met a young man named Tim. I think he was about 20 or maybe 21. And he was a friend of the girls that we had living with us, and he was a Cree Indian from Montana. He was part of a group of young people who were interning at the church as part of a Bible school program. Tim was getting ready to return to his people on the reservation in hope of reaching out to them with the gospel. I felt the Lord wanted me to accompany him and work on the reservation for a time. Tim agreed, and that it would be profitable for the kingdom, and we settled it that we would go sometime in early June. Well, when the girls found out our plans, they, with one voice, said they wanted to go. And there were two more of our friends who wanted to accompany us. I'm inclusive, and I'm liberal, and I thought it would be a good experience for them. They were young, all of them. I promised they could go. My wife was livid. She said she had no plans of going to Montana or Saskatchewan, Canada, and now she felt that she had no choice. I honestly never considered any problem with taking the girls with me. These were like all other girls to me. They were like daughters. I was old enough to be their father. And Linda had no natural reason to be apprehensive. But God was in it, because this expedition grew in number from Tim and me to include my wife, our three sons, the four girls, and Wayne and George, two friends who I knew in South Carolina, 12 in all. What was I thinking? We didn't even have driving accommodations for all of us. I could have taken my car or my van, but 12 people? And we had no money. Two people going out, a few bucks. 12? Sleeping, eating, driving? So I began to question the wisdom of this plan. And God had spoken to me to go with Tim and his people in Montana. And now I'm leading an entourage, and many of them, like my family, unwilling to go into the battle. Well, money began to come in for the trip until I had what I needed to get there, $2,500, though not enough for the return trip. I usually never had enough for the return trip. I always had enough to get there, but not usually enough to get back. So it was not unusual for this to happen. Also, an older couple in the church had a 23-foot Class C Midas motorhome that they offered for the trip, which I accepted. It wasn't large enough to sleep us all at the same time, so we purchased a tent, and we would take turns sleeping in the tent. Things were coming together nicely. The two brothers from South Carolina would drive themselves and meet us there. Our sons had a very nice but rambunctious dog that had to be cared for. Our friends Jim and Barb agreed to stay at our home with the twin sister of one of the girls who were part of our party. They agreed to care for our house and watch the dog while we were gone. The commitment was sealed. We were going. On Thursday night, a week or so before our scheduled departure date, I attended a church in the city of Detroit where I enjoyed the preaching. This brother always had a good, strong word of encouragement. Well, during the singing part of the service, I was reading in Joshua chapter 1. A lot of times when the singing is going on, I'm worshiping. When I'm in the Word, I'm reading the Word and enjoying what's being going on. My spirit is worshiping God. Just for a second, corporate worship. Oh gosh, I should continue with my story. Corporate worship obeys what God says, to come together as a house and lift up praise to Him. And that's what we do. That's what the point is. It's for God in our worship. Anyway, so Joshua was preparing to attack Jericho. And he was giving instructions to a part of the nation of Israel who had received the portion of their inheritance on the other side of the Jordan River. Verses 14 and 15 in chapter 1 jumped off the page at me. Your wives, your little ones, and your cattle shall remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side Jordan. But you shall pass before your brethren armed, and all the mighty men of valor, and help them until the Lord has given you rest, and you, as He has given you, and they also have possessed the land which the Lord your God gave them. And then you shall return to the land of your possession and enjoy it, which Moses, the Lord's servant, gave you on this side Jordan toward the sunrise. Pretty clear. Leave everybody home. Take Tim. You made a mistake. You went too far. I was young. 1981, I was 5 years old in Jesus. I'd had some experience with nothing like this. What a mess. So it reminded me of Abraham and Lot. God told Abraham to go, and Lot went too. Remember that? Well, here I have 8 young people, including my sons, chomping at the bit to go west. 2 men from South Carolina who are fully committed. The people who gave me money, the motor home, as well as Jim and Barb, who are pregnant and waiting to move into our home, all expecting us to go and minister to the Indians. And God is telling me to leave them all and go with Tim alone. I couldn't do it. I quickly laid aside this word and attributed it to my own mind. Well, I don't recall the exact date. Sometime between the 1st and 4th day of June, we drove away from our home and headed southwest to I-94 toward Chicago. The motorhome was packed with people and belongings, and the roof was loaded down with luggage and covered with a blue vinyl tarp that blew in the wind and shredded to threads in no time. I loved being on the road. Change was never a problem in my youth. I enjoyed the constant change of scenery, the various cultures of the country, and the different indigenous foods. Life on the road was an adventure for me. The girls were finding life in it as well. It was work for Linda, for my wife. She is at home in her living room, her kitchen, and her garden. She is a real homebody, and though she's very adaptable, this was no joy for her. My sons were chafing under the bit of the 5 mothers now. I was the peacemaker. You know, these 4 young women, 18, 19, 20 years old, they want to be mothers to my 14, 15, 16-year-old children. Anyway, they weren't that old, I don't think. But anyway, so we stopped at night in parks and recreation areas to sleep. We taking turns to sleep in the tent, which held 4 people. We usually cooked over a fire in the evening, and I would play my guitar and sing. And speaking of my guitar, let me tell you how it came to me. My friend Mike called me one morning to tell me he was looking in the paper for guitars. He felt I needed a better guitar for music in the house. I played it better than I did the piano, but he asked me to meet him near his home and we would go shopping together. I agreed and met him later that day. We went to a guitar store of note. It was a good guitar store. That's what they did, on Woodward Avenue in Birmingham, Michigan, and I played many guitars. And through the afternoon, I decided on a handmade Yamaha series model number L15A. It had a large body that fit me and a beautiful, full, rich, voluminous sound. Including the case, it was selling for over $900. But Mike, ever the buyer, got it down to $600. He then proceeded to tell me he would put up $500 and I could invest the balance of $100. I agreed, and he put a deposit on it to hold it for a day or 2. Over the next few days, I spent time in the cemetery until I knew I'd prevailed, and the $100 came in increments, and in a short time, we paid it off, and I brought it home. Just over 20 years later, I gave that guitar to my second-born son, who's an accomplished guitar player. By then, I had moved to the keyboard for my music. Well, during the day, we would stop at the side of the road or an available park to make and eat lunch. Linda made certain the girls helped in food preparation and serving, and she fed us small, healthy portions. The meal process reminded me of my youth, when we would travel as a family, and I'm the oldest of 8. We'd stop in what was then a roadside park on the side of the main road. There were no freeways in those days. My mother would cook a full meal of fried chicken, potatoes, vegetables, dessert, and drinks. It was an event. My girl was a great old Tennessee gal. Anyway, we were not in a particular hurry as we drove at a moderate speed across the country from Chicago. In Omaha, Nebraska, we turned north on I-29 and drove through South Dakota into North Dakota toward Fargo. We watched the crop dusting airplanes and swooping up and down and back and forth over the thousands of acres of planted fields. The telephones along the highway, the telephone poles along the highway were all alike. Long, tall poles with a crossbar on top that looked like crosses. I remember thinking that there was a cross of salvation for every person we would meet. Well, because we were loaded down with people and belongings, it took a bit of time to pass through customs at the Canadian border. They stumbled when I told them we were going to Saskatchewan to minister to the natives. I should have said we were on vacation. They would have understood that. So we continued north toward Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, to the main East Highway, number 1, and turned west toward Regina, Saskatchewan. The road was a blacktop 2-lane that followed the railroad tracks that connected small towns together that were usually no more than 10 or 12 miles apart. There was nothing but farms and mile after mile of wheat, corn, and bean fields. Each town was marked by a grain elevator, a small business area, no more than a couple of thousand residents, usually less. The main grocery store, Dominion, usually carried a variety of products, but no variety of brands. It was a novelty for us to shop and compare the shelves there with the shelves at home. We began to see how rich we were in the United States. The greater contrast would come in a few years when we left our home for our first trip to Central America. In Regina, Tim took us to the home of his aunt and uncle and introduced us. I cannot recall their names, but they were full-blood Cree Indians who lived in the city with their children. They were nice people. They welcomed us to park our mobile home in their driveway and set up housekeeping there. The lady of the house taught Linda how to make an Indian staple, bannock, or fried bread. I loved it, as did our boys. The girls, including Linda, said it was too fattening. We didn't get it much while there, and we never got it when we returned home to Michigan. But our hosts were part of a church, comprised mostly of Indians, that we began to attend and meet people in. I remember attending a couple of meetings in a park with a local evangelist. That was an experience. The ways and temperament of the indigenous people were different from us. They were quiet, reserved, and private. The reservations were poor, and the residents were exploited by the business people, usually stronger than the average people. The difference between the Canadian reservation and the U.S. reservation is this. The Canadian reservation belongs to the Indian. The businesses on Canadian reservations are owned and operated by Indians. The white man owns most everything on U.S. reservation. In the U.S., we could just drive on and stay if we wanted to. In Canada, one needs to obtain, at that point, 40 years ago, needed to obtain approval from the tribal chief to remain on a reserve for more than a day of visiting. We didn't need that favor because we had quarters with our hosts. I had many conversations with young natives and men in their late teens and early 20s, and they stumbled over the white man's church. They did not believe that God dwelled in a building of brick and mortar, but they could be found in a field or the woods or anywhere for that matter. Of course, I agreed with them. They also considered our belief in Jesus as the Messiah as a part of the brick and mortar mentality and could not see him as a part of their culture. They wanted to see the old native ways revived. This may have been their way of fighting God off, who was confronting them through me. One day we were in the Humane Park in Regina where we spread our lunch and sat on the ground in blankets eating. And I picked up my guitar and began to sing and play. Before long, two young women sauntered over and set up their blankets with their lunch and listened to my songs. I continued for a bit and struck up a conversation with them. They were German citizens who had come to the U.S. to be au pairs, nannies, on a temporary basis. Their assignment was a one-year commitment whereby they would work for families in Boston for 9 months and then travel for the remaining 3 months before returning to Germany. These girls had chosen to hitchhike across Canada to the Pacific coast in Vancouver and south into California and then east across the U.S. to Boston and their departure for home in Europe. They were still on the first westward leg of their journey and were now in the presence of someone who would tell them about the love of God in the Lord Jesus Christ for the very first time in their lives. They listened attentively to my speaking about God and said they had no memory of hearing this news back in Germany. I couldn't believe it, but I believe they were sincere. To follow up on these girls, when we returned home to Livonia, I met a young man whose name was Tom, of whom I will speak more about in a subsequent chapter, who told me he was driving from Montana to Michigan and picked up a couple of female hitchhikers within the time frame of my experience in Regina. We described them to each other and determined they were indeed the same ones. He confirmed to them the message I had brought and rejoiced that God was indeed planting his word in them to become disciples of Jesus. You just never know. Well, just west of Wolf Point, Montana, in Fraser, on the Fort Peck Reservation is the site of the annual Red Bottom celebration. It's a Cree Indian Pow Wow that Tim wanted to attend. Montana is truly the big sky state. As we drove west, we could see for miles over the eastern flatlands. The area was experiencing a drought, and the sky was blue and clear. As we neared the site of the celebration, perhaps 40 miles out, we could see a portion of the sky was dark ahead of us. We continued on and realized the darkness was rain, coming down in slanted sheets. I thought about Las Vegas and the approach overland from any direction to the city at night. All is dark and desert, and then a faint glow appears in the distance. As you draw nearer the city, you can see that the lights create an oasis in the desert of light and greenery. The Red Bottom celebration was indeed red bottom. The rain was confined to the local area of Fraser, and the clay at the site was red and slippery with water. The local farmers had paid the chief and the medicine men to dance for rain, and the rain came. Explain that to me. I felt the oppression of the religion on the premises. Therefore, I warned my family to be on alert and not agree with what was happening. The dancing by the braves was a driving force, as both the young and the old sat around the large kettle drum, beating out the rhythm and chanting native mantras. This was worship to their gods of darkness. The dancers, they didn't know that. They were just in a tradition. They had no idea what was really going on with their worship. They didn't know they were worshiping. The dancers were dressed as birds and animals and seemed to be drugged into a stupor. Those dressed as hawks moved like hawks. The rest of the dancers moved like the animals they represented. I understood the spirit world, and I saw the fruit of this world on the reserves in alcoholism, drug addiction, poverty, anger, and violence, and the loss of hope among the people who were kept in prison by the spirit world. My response to this celebration offended Tim, and he parted company from us, remaining at Wolf Point, Montana, with his immediate family. We returned to Regina and our host. In their church was a white woman from another U.S. state, and I do not recall which one. She had moved to Regina and took up a place of authority among the Indians, which was not very difficult to do. These Indians were docile people and seemed to be easily led about by this woman or anyone who would take authority. She resented my presence and the fact that I knew the scriptures better than she. The greatest rub was the fact that I knew the voice of God and spoke out what he was saying to me. She began to turn the church and its leadership against me. I finally confronted her publicly and shut her down. This was a terrible mistake of pride on my part. It was akin to Moses when he killed the Egyptian who was mistreating the Hebrews when they were slaves. Moses was confused when they didn't recognize that he was taking their part and setting them free from their captors. I experienced the same confusion. Years later, Moses returned as a gentle shepherd, and God's work of time in that experience had the same effect on me. This response on my part destroyed my witness and ministry among the Navy people, and my reason for going to Canada at all was Tim and his people. My purpose was defeated. I called Jim at our house to see how things were going. He informed me that the dog was such a bother that they took him to the city pound. That's pretty exciting, isn't it? She was happening at home by my rebellion. My sons would be devastated. He also said that the bank, who now owned the property, had called and wanted to speak with me right away. We've been gone from home for over 3 weeks, and I told Jim we would be starting back soon. Lynn and I got on our knees, weeping and praying, giving the house back to God. We each had a picture of all we owned sitting on the road in easy pickings for whosoever wanted our stuff. We were sure the bank would evict everybody and sell the property. It was a prime piece of real estate, right on 7 Mile Road. 2 of the girls we took with us jumped ship. One called her father for airfare home, and the other stayed on with a European woman who was a believer and had been transplanted to Canada. I felt that beginning with the defection of Tim, things had been falling apart, and I began to realize that my disobedience in not leaving the gang home was bringing chastisement to me from the Lord. I thought about home and the loss of the dog, the intrusion of the bank, the Canadian mail strike that prevented us from receiving funds from anyone who might want to send us money. We were out of money, and even the motorhome had some problems that were not there when we had originally left Michigan. How was I going to pay for the repairs that would be necessary? We were limping along the highway toward home. Just east of Regina was the small town of Grenfell, Saskatchewan. We pulled into an inexpensive RV site and set up camp. We had no money to continue. So I hitchhiked the 40 miles back to Regina to sell a little gold pinky ring that I owned. The price of gold was high, and I figured I could get enough to buy a squeegee and bucket to wash windows to earn money to continue our journey. I was going to work our way home. I received $30 or $40 for the ring, and while hitchhiking back to camp, I was picked up by a carload of young men who were drinking and partying. I began to preach the gospel to them, and they all, no exception, said they'd never heard this story. I thought about the German girls and wondered how anyone could live in this world, not hear the gospel. Somebody wasn't doing their job. In Grenfell, we were parked next to a Canadian man and his Tongan wife, Peter and Catalina. Years later, I talked with Peter on the phone. They were following the large Canadian pipeline installation crew, and he was working as a medic. He'd met his wife when he sailed his 25-foot sailboat alone from Vancouver to San Diego to Hawaii to American Samoa and on to Tonga, where he moored his ship offshore and wooed her father to give her to him as his wife. Did you know at that time that the king of Tonga was a Christian? True. Catalina was a Christian and a lovely woman who was pregnant with their first and who would be their only child. Peter went on to become relatively famous in a certain sailing circle, and he owns a charter business and lives in the South Pacific with Catalina today. The Lord kept us in Grenfell while I spoke daily to Peter about the kingdom of God and the love of and purpose of Jesus had for him. I even wrote to him after we returned home. We enjoyed hours of fellowship with Catalina. We still had no money with which to continue our journey home, and there were no places I could wash windows to make a few bucks to buy gasoline. There was a highway building project close by, and I applied for a job there. The foreman said he could not hire me because I was not a Canadian citizen, but that he could hire the girls as traffic directors. I didn't like this. I could see that these guys were on the make, and the girls were vulnerable. I let the guys know that the girls were off limits. If they were not gentlemen, they'd have to deal with me, and it would not be pleasant. I also warned the girls. One of them became a momentary problem, but I was able to deal with it. The chastisement I was receiving for my disobedience was weakening me morally, and I felt the girls were growing increasingly independent. But they wanted to work, and we needed the money. I felt extremely weak. But I had no choice. I was morally depleted. They worked for about 2 weeks and earned enough money to continue on our journey. In Anoka, Minnesota, we stopped, and I set out to find some window washing jobs. I went from store to store, offering my services to no avail. I finally entered a shoe store that specialized in selling expensive brands of children's shoes. The owner was engaged with a customer, and when he saw my bucket and mop, he motioned for me to wait for him. I thought, oh, good, I'm finally hitting pay dirt. In a few minutes, he dismissed the customer and told me to set my bucket in a corner and follow him. He led me out the back door of the store, down the alley, into the back door of a local coffee shop. He told the waitress to bring 2 coffees, and we sat at a booth. He pulled $10 from his pocket, laid it on the table in front of me, and said he didn't want his windows washed, but he wanted to talk with me. And here's what he began with. Why do you have such peace? I'm a long way from home with no money, with all these troubles, and he wants to know why I have peace. Jesus is the peace, not Kennard. Isn't that wonderful? I began to tell him about Jesus and his purpose for our lives. He told me that he had just returned from Mexico, where children had no shoes, and now he has to deal with kids whose parents are willing to spend exorbitant amounts of money on their shoes, and the kids refuse the shoes because of the color of the shoestrings or whatever. He was looking for the justice and was just tired of the world. I continued speaking to him of the kingdom of God and exhorted him to believe and receive it. He told me he had many friends who said they were Christians, and he had one that was just like me. Therefore, he was certain the man was a real Christian, not just a church member. Did you know that Christianity is a religion? Think about it. I was just amazed. Here I am in the midst of tough chastisement for my disobedience, broke, tired. My family was exhausted, and we were a long way from home on my failed mission, and he somehow sees the peace of God in me. We spent a half hour together, and he said he had to get back to work. He thanked me, and we parted company. That was it. I thought that I should call Jim and see how things were going at home, if he was still there. He said he and Barb were well, and that he had heard no more from the bank, and that they were now alone in the house. He asked where we were, and that he wanted to send him $200 by Western Union for our journey. I rejoiced and thanked God. We're going home. Well, we arrived home in August after just over 7 weeks on the road. My family was so relieved to be back in familiar surroundings. And of course I was too. But I was bruised. I was hurting. I spent several days in the cemetery, as I quietly reconnoitered through prayer and meditation what benefit could have been had for the people I was sent to if I had not disobeyed God. A great lesson was learned, and one I have never forgotten. I learned that I was never to make decisions without first consulting God, and that when he spoke to me, I must wait for any details that he might want to provide. The future held many opportunities to apply this valuable lesson, and still does. I'm in the middle of something right now that I'm seeking God for details on. Same kind of a thing. He's wonderful after 45 years. The people who owned the motorhome didn't flinch when I returned it, needing tires of interior work. They were delighted that it was not damaged further after 7 weeks on the road occupied by all these people. I never met the banker. Linda called, and the representative came to our house to talk. She informed him of what we had done to the house to make it livable, and that Consumers Power had installed insulation and roof vents for us without cost because our reported income was below the poverty level. He then informed Linda of their caretaker program, which we could remain in the home free of charge as the caretakers until such time as the bank concluded the disposition of the property. The only change that we would experience is that the bank would now pay the water bill. I wondered how long it would be before I really trusted God. So